But I think psychologically, it almost has more of an impact than it does physically. For the Russians, we understand, have already moved some of their really precious bombers, 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers away from Ukraine just to make them safe. Well, Sun Tzu would say that's exactly the way you want to fight a war.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today we're privileged to be talking to an old friend, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish is Director of Doctors Under Fire, I think still, a former British Army Colonel, an expert on CBRN. That's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear for the uninitiated, and biosecurity. And of course, you're the author of Chemical Warrior, a great book which I really enjoyed reading. Hamish, welcome back to Frontline.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Phil.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. Now, as everyone focuses on Israel and Iran, people are not really listening to what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. And the Russians seem to like that. Russian newspapers today report that Vladimir Putin phoned Donald Trump up at the weekend to wish him happy birthday for his 79th birthday. In fact, they quoted Putin as saying, "Happy birthday, Donald." Should we be worried?
Well, I think we should actually. I think we really should. What one would have hoped to describe their relationship as sort of ambiguous, but it's not really that. I think in the last few days or last week, didn't Trump organise a military parade to sort of allegedly to rival what happens in Moscow on the 9th of May each year? And I didn't see a lot of it, but what I saw of it, the drill might be up to your and my standard, but certainly not up to the standard you'd expect, for elite regiments performing on the parade square, like the Guards did at the weekend for Trooping the Colour. And yes, the familiarity, in my book, that sort of breeds contempt. And until fairly recently, a lot of the exchanges between Putin and Trump have been very much on a sort of a pally side, rather than the leader of the most powerful military in the world trying to persuade President Putin that actually a ceasefire and a peace deal in Ukraine is in the very best interests of absolutely everybody. So, yeah, I am a little concerned. I think, like a lot of other people, have been concerned on some of Trump's close advisors, like Steve Witkoff and others, who again, seem to find it rather easier speaking to the Russians than they do the Ukrainians or perhaps us European NATO allies. So I think we're going to have to watch this pretty carefully. And as you say, while everybody is focused on the Middle East at the moment, there is concern exactly what's happening in Ukraine, which is the main threat. If you look at purely from a UK basis, what happens in Ukraine, it has potential real importance to us, rather less so, I expect, than what happens in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The Russian newspapers are certainly stirring the pot. They go on to say it's up to us to deal with Kyiv and to deal with the EU as well, because the EU won't leave us in peace. Again, should we be worried? And do you think there's the potential that Trump sees Russia as a way of neutralizing or paralyzing the EU as an economic competitor?
Well, yeah, I mean, that when one reflects on what some of his close advisors have described Europe, pathetic Europe, I think Pete Hesketh and J.D. Vance refer to us this side of the pond, having allegedly relied on the US far too much for our military protection. And to be fair to them, they do have a point there. I think it's very clear that Trump and his close advisors are far more interested in what happens in the Middle East and the Far East, and a lot less what happens in Europe. And of course, the European Economic Community, or whatever we call it these days, is a very powerful financial mass that has got Trump's hackles up for sure. And it might be a little bit too Machiavellian to think that Putin is actually doing his bidding here. But I think, with what's happening, or what has happened since President Trump came to power, certainly on his financial ways, the way he's developing these tariff wars, any throwaway lines sadly we have to take fairly seriously. So yeah, I think as he moves away from Europe, we need to take up the cudgel much more firmly ourselves.
Yeah, but whenever Russia says that they're going to have to focus on Europe and the EU, I think the Ukrainians are doing quite a good job on focusing on the Russians. We had last week the very audacious Operation Spider's Web, those drones flying against Russian strategic bombers. We've had the Kerch Bridge being attacked. We're getting defense industries being attacked over this weekend. The Ukrainian GUR or HUR, their military intelligence under General Bogdanov, attacked an industrial substation in Königsberg in Kaliningrad, knocking out the power to the Russian military industrial complex and the army facilities that are there. And on the 14th of June, they actually drained the coolant from a transformer. Might that have happened at Heathrow? And set fire to the facility. At the same time, Ukrainian drones attacked the Russian UAV manufacturer, and it's that manufacturer that builds, whether it's under license or copies of the Iranian Shahad 136 drones and others. Do you think these Ukrainian attacks are likely to become more intense, and will they really affect the outcome of the war?
Well, as you and I will understand it, Phil, this is the deep battle shaping the battlefield, as it were, to try and enable your sort of close operations to be more effective. I think everybody has been impressed by what the SBU and the GUR have been able to do. I mean, this is classic sabotage. This is straight out of the Special Operations Executive from the Second World War. And I as a slight adjunct, the Strategic Defence Review that was detailed last week, which to me was a pretty good piece of work. Probably a lot short of money than has been promised, but actually this sort of capability, which unless you've got endless amounts of money, endless amounts of ammunition, etc., 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 you have got to be innovative. You've got to be devious. You've got to run these sort of lines. Not least, I mean, the operator Spider's Web, as you discussed, and these other ones, these are certainly having an operational impact, even a strategic impact in some particular cases. A tremendous bang for your buck. So it is the way to go. But I think psychologically, it almost has more of an impact than it does physically. For the Russians, we understand, have already moved some of their really precious bombers, 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers away from Ukraine, just to make them safe. Well, Sun Tzu would say that's exactly the way you want to fight a war. Make sure that you do stuff that means that the enemy can't fight you. So I think that has been really, really impressive. We are aware of the Russians trying similar type of sabotage across Europe. You've potentially mentioned a few, and there have been other mysterious fires that one could put down there. But I think it's, we might come on to the Israeli special operations in Iran later. It is a similar sort of playbook, but I think it is really important. And when you can't, get armored divisions, if you like, steaming across, the plains of Ukraine to vanquish the Russians, actually it's not a death by 1,000 cuts, because some of these cuts are pretty brutal, but it's really impressive, and we applaud them. What a great job they're doing, and let's hope they can continue to do that. And a long answer to your question, I think ultimately these sort of actions have an event, because there is no way that the Russian spin machine and propaganda machine can spin this up into anything other than a flipping disaster. And Russia's sort of, you get a feeling within Russia they're slightly losing hold of the narrative, and people are suddenly sort of questioning, are we really doing a great thing? Are we really winning? Really getting rid of all these Ukrainian Nazis, sort of thing. So, I think it's really important and very impressive.
Isn't it interesting? We're seeing parallels and tactics between what Mossad, the Israeli intelligence services, are doing and what the Ukrainian intelligence services are doing. We had that very audacious attack that effectively wiped out the senior leadership of Hezbollah with the pagers, followed up by the radios. We've seen the attacks into Iran where apparently components for drones had been smuggled in over months. That was exactly the same as Operation Spider's Web. Do you think there might be a little bit of cross-fertilization, or is this, as you said, just taking the old Special Operations Executive type handbook, applying it to modern conflict? And is this something that you think Western militaries, we've had strategic defense review, as you mentioned, we should be more cognizant of? Are we finding a role potentially for, the new Rangers to support special forces groups in doing, and getting into these sorts of tactics? We're always very good at innovation, but we should be training people in these sorts of things and sabotage and everything else beforehand so that it's almost second nature. What do you think?
Well, I think your first question, is there a bit of Mossad DNA on the SBU and the GUR? I wouldn't be at all surprised, and I think it's sort of fairly open source that the Israelis have been, helping in a certain degree with some of the training. So that makes sense. But these are not the only people who do these sort of things and these sort of operations. And I'm sure we would like to think that our own security services and special forces are doing similar type of operations. But it's when we look at going, should we be focusing on this? Yeah, I think absolutely. As well as I do, you can't just generate special forces and security agents out of thin air. There is a bit of a hint in the name there, but you can certainly invest in that capability and in a way make it more mainstream. And your point about the Ranger battalions, absolutely, that sort of tier 2 or second level for common parlance special forces is something that's coming more to prominence. And perhaps by investing them, you can get more bang for your buck than you would out of buying more aircraft or aircraft carriers or tanks or whatever it is. But I don't think this is anything new. This is the sort of stuff that spies and their like have been doing since time immemorial. The fact that the Ukrainians have managed to adapt so quickly, and the fact that some of the Mossad operations, as you say, like the pagers against Hezbollah, is so much in the public domain, extraordinary activity. We're also used to things happening now, yesterday, so very quickly, and give them as much ammunition as they can to beat off some small incursion in the Donetsk or whatever it is. But actually, when you look at these operations planned over many, many months, if not years, and to be able to execute them, that shows a level of capability that I expect it's beyond the imagination of most people, even some of us lot who have sort of lived this life for a few years. So I think it's extraordinary, and absolutely, it must be what we're investing in if, as is the case, we don't have limitless resources to spend on defence.
Well, isn't it interesting? Donald Trump in that horrible attack in the Oval Office on President Zelensky turned around and said he's got no cards to play. And I think ever since then, Zelensky has played card after card after card after card. I suspect Donald Trump is feeling slightly bruised at that. But you're again looking at Russia's newspapers today. They said that in one headline that Kyiv is forgotten. And they're talking about the brewing conflict in the Middle East. Do you think Putin's a beneficiary of the conflict between Israel and Iran?
Well, unfortunately, I think he is, absolutely. I think, first of all, it's been startling, Putin's silence. His alleged close ally in the Middle East, Iran, as you've articulated before, supplying him with so much important kit. In their hour of need, Putin has sort of, not quite given them a couple of fingers, but has offered himself as a negotiator. Which is almost beyond parody that Putin is going to come to the peace. But yeah, I think it is much to the direct detriment of Kyiv. Everybody is looking to the Middle East, and as we mentioned earlier, and as Trump has said many times, his focus is Middle East and Indo-Pacific. He's much less interested in what's happening in Europe. And I think some of the second order or even first order the fact that the price of oil has gone through $80 a barrel because of this, part of one of the good things that Trump was suggesting is he was going to drive oil below $40 a barrel, and with most of Putin's foreign currency and reserves coming from selling oil to the Chinese and the Indians, at $40 a barrel, there's barely enough money to keep his war machine going. At $80 a barrel, that's a different story. So, it's an unfortunate consequence of what's happening in the Middle East that, it really hasn't helped Kyiv in any way at all.
Again, the Russian newspapers today picked up on that very fact that the oil price going up and potential restrictions on the volume of oil that Iran's going to be able to export will just be beneficial to Russia, especially when it comes to contracts with China and everything else. So they're seeing this as very positive. And again, the Hamas attack on Israel, the one thing from my perspective that seemed to achieve was taking the war in Ukraine off the headlines. And we've been talking about what's going on in the Middle East almost ever since. And that's kept Vladimir Putin in a stronger position. It's all frighteningly linked, especially when you look at this axis of evil between Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China, as people keep talking about. Do you think there's a proper link there that we should be worried about?
Well, I think there's certainly a link between Iran, North Korea, and Russia. And one of my big concerns is with ammunition going from Iran and North Korea to Russia, what is going the other way? And, if it is intelligence around developing nuclear weapons capability, which I expect it probably is, then that is what one's concerned about. The North Koreans seem to have some sort of warhead. They have some sort of viable missiles, but the smart money is they don't have the technology to wire them all together at the moment. Now, that would very easily come from Russia, I expect. And in the same vein, we're talking about what's happening in Iran with their centrifuges and developing uranium to a level of enrichment that they can then weaponize it. We know they have missiles, but having the technology to put the two together is a concern that some of that might be flowing Russia-wise. I think when it comes to China, I'm sort of less certain. I think China is playing the game that China always plays, being very, very silent at the moment, sitting so firmly on every single fence that they can sort of lean each way. And of course, there are so many dynamics that Putin, rather Trump, very much sees the Chinese as his main adversaries, economically and militarily, and that is almost a separate entity that is happening at the moment. That perhaps we're not keeping a close eye, but maybe that's what the Americans really are focusing on, and in a way they might be right, because any conflict between those two countries would be hugely, more significant than virtually anything else. And then we hear that Trump and the government in Beijing have done a deal over tariffs. And again, it's difficult to sometimes understand what Trump's saying when he's doing a deal and when he's not doing a deal. And again, the ambiguity coming out of his mouth, I don't think through it's any sort of his vast intellectual superiority. I think his attention span is rather short for the president of the United States. So we shall see. So I'm the triumvirate of Iran, Russia, and North Korea. Yeah, that is a huge concern. China, that's a different issue. Could be as bad, but I don't think it's necessarily interred in this one.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. My personal view is I think China is buying as much of Russia as it possibly can, in the same way it's sort of bought Africa with critical infrastructures put in and all the rest of it. But it's doing that in this tacit support it's giving Russia in its war with Ukraine. And the natural resources it's taking, and it will have some form of ownership deal over some of the mines, oil wells, and various other things that they will come back and say, this is ours. Or they will, if Russia collapses, go to take it. But that's a completely different discussion. One of the things that didn't get widely reported in the press whenever Donald Trump had his first telephone conversation with Vladimir Putin a couple of months ago. It was supposedly, and it was reported, it was all about peace talks and starting some form of ceasefire talks with Ukraine. But one of the little throwaways in there was he turned around and asked Vladimir Putin to ensure that Iran did not get a weapon that could destroy Israel. And that, to me, again, I agree with you, would suggest the passing across of not just nuclear knowledge, but potentially nuclear warheads. You've written extensively about the potential for the use of tactical nuclear warheads by Russia inside Ukraine. Do you think we're on a nuclear escalation ladder across the globe? And do you think if two elements, one, if Iran got a nuclear weapon, it would try and use it against Israel, and what's stopping Russia using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, yeah, we could probably talk about this for several hours. I'll try and coalesce it into a minute or so. I think the nuclear proliferation over the last 2 decades has been a real problem. And I think a lot of it is it's a bit like the peace dividend. People have just taken their focus off it. We've seen what's happened in North Korea, and we've continued to see Iran trying to develop a capability. But let's not forget as well, the Chinese have built more nuclear warheads than anybody else in the last 10 years. And although their holding is, less than a fifth of what the Americans have, it is growing, and they are certainly looking into that. To me, the whole nuclear conundrum, if you like, is about parity and equilibrium. And I think, until with the Cold War and really probably up until 10 years ago, we pretty much had that. And that worked well when you just really had the Americans and the Russians. Of course, China until recently has been a very much bit player in the nuclear piece. We've had the Indians and the Pakistanis who, they have but sort of cancelled themselves out. And then, and that has worked fairly well. However, I think what has happened with the invasion into Ukraine is that, and also with the Americans sort of standing back, one gets the feeling in Europe we can no longer necessarily rely on the Americans come charging over the Atlantic to help us. And in a similar vein on the nuclear side, maybe when we're talking about Armageddon, mutually assured destruction, sure, the Americans are going to prevent that happening. But on a smaller scale, when you look at what's happening in Europe and the amount of tactical nuclear weapons that Putin has at his disposal, although he has less fighters to fire them off now, and less Iskander missiles, but it's still there. I mean, I've had various debates with various people, in front of closed doors and behind closed doors of what if Russia did drop a tactical nuclear weapon into Ukraine, how would Europe react? I'm sure the assumption Putin's come to that Britain is not going to fire off a Trident missile, and I'm sure he's right there. Of course, the French do have a tactical capability, which they have said would be very much in play for Europe. So that is a consideration. Or even if what happened if the Russians dropped something in the Swaco Gap, how would we react to that? And also, and the whole thing is clouded by the fact that Putin and his attack dogs, Medvedev and Peskov and the rest of them, are threatening nuclear strikes virtually every day, which sort of loses its currency in a way. But it is a concern, and I think that's something that we need to sort of consider. I think the final piece on Putin's tactical nuclear weapons, it's something he's still got his arsenal. If he really wants to make some headway and take out huge amounts of forces, then it is an option to him. But I still think that that is an all and bust. He must be absolutely convinced that Trump won't react. So at the moment, One expects to hear them keep threatening it, but let's hope that we don't go there, because even a tactical nuclear weapon, I think that could lead to very much more nuclear activity that nobody wants.
Yeah, well, a tactical nuclear weapon will have a strategic effect, if it's used, anything like that, and I think that would really affect any tacit support from China and elsewhere. But where do you think we are now with the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia? Has the US effectively walked away? Is it dead in the water, or was it ever in the water?
Well, I think what hasn't changed is that Putin has no interest in peace or a ceasefire at the moment. There's just been recording 1 million casualties, Russian casualties. That sort of information is now flooding around Russia. People are beginning to understand it. Most of the rank and file in Russia are actually in a pretty poor situation. When it comes to the price of food and what they're earning. It's only the elite who are still charging around in their Rolls Royces, sort of thing. So I think Putin has absolutely no interest in peace. When one looks at what Trump has done thus far, you could come to the conclusion it's a bit of a half-hearted effort, and his antipathy towards the Europeans, us lot, and the Ukrainians has been pretty extraordinary for an American president. But we sort of are where we are. Have the Americans walked away? Well, I think certainly at the moment that they're far more interested in supporting the Israelis and keeping a close eye on China than they are on what's happening in Europe. So, I think it is very much up to Europeans and ourselves now. If we to make progress, then we're really going to have to lean into it. I think ultimately we might still have the American military backstop if everything goes completely wrong, as it were. But I can't see Trump expending too much more time and effort, trying to drag Putin to a table for a ceasefire or a just ceasefire that Ukraine can accept.
Mm-hmm. So I tend to ask a lot of my guests this final question because we've got the conflict in Europe, the war. It's a war in Europe. We've got brewing conflict in the Middle East that may turn into a war, and we've got tensions growing into in Southeast Asia that may turn into conflict and then may turn to war. From your perspective, do you think we're on a path to wider European or global conflict/war?
Well, with so many variables around at the moment, almost anything can happen. But maybe my glass is too half full. I don't know. When I look at the Middle East, and certainly what I've written about today in another newspaper, actually, Iran without nuclear capability makes a safer place. And I'm fairly reassured that there are not a lot of people charging in to help Iran and support Iran. Of course, their own militias, Hezbollah, the Houthis and Hamas, and the Iranian militias that we saw a lot of in Iraq, have pretty much disappeared as an effective fighting force, as it were. So, I'm keeping my fingers crossed in the Middle East. When it comes to Europe, I think whatever we think of Trump and the way he's played it, what he has done is make Europe realize that we have got to be responsible for our own security. And the fact that virtually every country in Europe now is upping its defense spending, the fact that even the Germans have broken the glass ceiling about spending on defense and are planning to put, I think, 200 billion euros into defense in the next 5 years and continue to develop capability. That actually, and also that Finland and Sweden are now part of NATO. So a sort of European NATO defense, we've got to assume won't include the Americans. But actually, when you put it all together and when you match military capability for military capability, what we have in Europe still, it should vastly overmatch what the Russians have. Stand fast, the nuclear issue we've already covered. So I think Europe has the ability, if it can get the coordinated leadership together, to do the job that we were hoping Trump would do. So if that happens, and if we lean into it, and even Sir Keir Starmer, who before he became prime minister, nobody thought that this human rights lawyer would be there leading the charge with Macron, with a gun in hand, as it were. But he seems to be making the right noises. If we and the French can manage for one time in our lives to actually work together coherently, and we can garner the energy created by the Poles and the Nordic states, then I think we should be able to hopefully prevent the war spreading outside Ukraine, and with a fair wind, enable Ukraine to get a just peace that they will accept. Putin at some stage will realize, or his army will culminate, and they will have to discuss peace. But certainly at the moment, it's not looking that way. And if a lot of things go how they shouldn't, and that's how disasters generally happen, then we could be in a different situation. But I'm, again, glass very much half full. I think if our leaders do the right thing, we hopefully should avoid escalation in the Middle East and escalation in Europe. I certainly hope so.
Well, I'll certainly raise a half full glass to that. Hamish, it's been a real pleasure chatting to you this afternoon on Frontline.
And you, Philip. Thanks very much for having me.
So you've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership with the link below. And we're now available as a podcast. So just go to your favourite podcast provider and search Times Radio Frontline. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs or read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.